Hey y'all, Jamie here with another episode of Milk, Honey, and Mayhem. Thank you to everyone who subscribed, and if you haven't, what are you waiting on, darling? It's free, it helps my channel grow, and you get notified every time I drop a new video, like this one. Today we're getting into what I consider to be one of the most horrifying yet fascinating tales of true crime in all of Giles County. The Bondurant twins. Now, there is a trigger warning associated with this one, so if you're sensitive, it's okay to sit this one out. And if you've got little ones nearby, you might want to pop in those headphones. All right, let's get into it. Our story begins on April 4th, 1955, when Hugh and Polly Bondurant became parents to twin boys, Hugh Peter Bondurant Jr. and Kenneth Patterson Bondurant, better known as Pete and Pat. Hugh and Polly were both contractors for the military and worked at Redstone Arsenal just across the state line in Huntsville, Alabama. It wouldn't be too long before they added another son and a daughter to the family. Now, Hugh was known to be pretty hard on the boys, but by all accounts, they were decent parents. These fellas took identical to the extreme. They looked alike, sounded alike, and dressed alike. Even as grown men, they always had matching plaid flannel shirts, Liberty overalls, and a scruffy beard. Pete was known to be more outgoing and talkative, but there was no surefire way to tell them apart. And they were so inseparable that they even managed to squeeze themselves into the same seat on the school bus every day. A spectacle, I'm sure, considering they each weighed over 300 pounds by the time they were in the 7th grade. They were bullied because, of course, they were. Unfortunately, kids can be cruel. Some adults can be worse, but I won't step up on that soapbox today. Now, these boys were smart, really smart, but clearly their cornbread wasn't done all the way in the middle. As preteens, they would bury kittens in the yard up to their necks, start the lawnmower, and yeah, it's exactly what you're thinking. My apologies. Here's my boy Phineas for tax. After graduating high school, Pat stuck around and wandered into the drug scene, while Pete decided to set out on his own and move to Cincinnati. Living in an apartment with 2 other men and 2 women and completely lost without his brother, Pete found his own way into the same drug scene. The 2 women went out one night to buy some cigarettes, and the sight they returned to was a horrific one. When they opened the door, they saw Pete standing there, covered in blood with a knife in his hand. One of the men lay bleeding out on the couch with over 40 stab wounds that had been made by a screwdriver. The other man lay crumpled against the wall, having already succumbed to the much more brutal knife attack. Pete never said why he did it, and he was only 19 years old when he was sentenced to 25 years inside an Ohio prison. He only served 5 of those years before being paroled due to overcrowding in the jail combined with the fact that he wasn't an Ohio native. So they turned him loose and sent him on home to live with his brother. Big mistake. Big. Huge. While Pete was locked up, Pat met a woman named Denise and married her in 1983, becoming the stepfather to a young boy with cerebral palsy. They moved into the old Turner farmhouse in Elkton, right off I-65. If you've ever passed the Big Chicken at the Shady Lawn truck stop there at exit 6, the house sat across the hill right there, right across the street from the Booby Bungalow. This was the environment that Pete moved back into, but things changed quickly with the brothers back together. The only thing these 2 loved more than food was drugs. Pete and Pat both made good money working down at the rubber plant, and there was always a surplus of both at the farmhouse. By the mid-'80s, the brothers had earned their reputation as the best dealers south of the Mason-Dixon line. Fueled by fear, fun, and a lot of Dr. Feelgood, the twins gained a Charles Manson-like following, so much so that their old farmhouse became known as the Spawn Ranch of the South. A constant party, a free-flowing supply of drugs, and a feeling that no rules applied, Pat liked to remind everyone to keep their behavior in check by eating a pound of raw hamburger meat while maintaining eye contact. The only ones who needed that reminder were the twins themselves. Gwen Dugger was a 24-year-old single mother. One night in May of 1986, she rode with her brother out to the farmhouse. It didn't take too long for her to pass out from indulging in too many party favors, and Pat assured Gwen's brother that she'd be fine, he'd give her a ride home the next day, and sent him on his way. Now, despite her penchant for partying, Gwen was a good mama. When she didn't show up after a few days, her family went to the house and confronted the brothers. Pete told them that she hadn't been there, and they hadn't even heard from her recently. Now, the brothers were investigated, but no evidence was found. Small towns are going to gossip, as small towns do, but nobody was speaking facts on this one. Probably because Pat kept 2 spent shells in his pocket that he openly called his Gwenny bees, and anytime he ran into anyone who might have knowledge of what happened that night, he'd pull them out and rattle them in his hand, all the while smiling and making the same eye contact that Pete did while he wolfed down that raw meat. Shh, I'd have kept my mouth shut too. 1986 will end up being quite the year for these two. In August, Denise divorced Pat after an argument where he had her down on the floor choking and hitting her while she was pregnant with his child. So she moved in with her sister, but her son's disability check continued to be mailed to the farmhouse. Pat knew she didn't have a bank account, so he promised to cash it for her and give her the money. The next day when she came by, Pat told her that his wallet had been stolen the night before. Embarrassed and angry, he told her that no one takes anything from him or little Matthew, and then he promised that he would make it right. Ronnie Gaines, better known as Hippie, worked down at the rubber plant with the brothers. One October night, he was down at the farmhouse with them, just partying and playing cards, and out of nowhere, Pat jumped up and accused him of stealing his wallet. He hadn't. But that was the last time anyone saw Ronnie Gaines. The next day, old Hippie's house was found burned to the ground. The Tennessee fire marshal did bring Pat in on suspicion of arson, but he insisted he couldn't have done it because he was with his girlfriend Terry Lynn Clark all night. They agreed to interview Terry Lynn the next day and let him go. That wouldn't happen, though, because when investigators went to bring Terry Lynn Clark in for questioning, they found her dead in Pete's bed from an overdose. Pete kept on rattling his Gwenny bees around town and the cases went cold. They probably would have stayed that way too, but nobody gets shit done like a Southern woman scorned, especially when she falls for a lawman and gets offered an immunity deal. Y'all, Denise sang like a canary. In May of 1990, Denise described each murder and the circumstances surrounding them, stating that brutality is not something that is new to me, but these two were beasts. The night of Gwen Dugger's murder, Denise said that Gwen was fed pills all night by Pete, Pat, and several other men who were hanging around the house. At some point, she walked in to find her husband raping a very unconscious Gwen. She tried to slap some wake-up into her and flew into Pat. While they were arguing, Pete loaded Gwen into the back of the truck and drove her to the barn. Denise left to cool off for a bit, and once she was gone, Pete, Pat, and the other men took turns violating a still unconscious Gwen. Pete, awful proud of himself, walked across the street to the Booby Bungalow. A woman employed as a dancer there at the time said that he came through the door with a big smile across his face and told everyone that, quote, he had a whore tied up to a bale of hay if anyone needed a good fuck. At some point, she was taken back up to the house, and when Denise returned, that's where she found her, groggy and confused and completely unaware of what had happened. Pat, in a drug-fueled rage, grabbed an axe that was laying nearby and beat Gwen over the head between 9 to 12 times and then began raping her dying body, right in front of his wife. Pete, hearing the commotion from the next room, rushed in, grabbed the .22 out of his pocket, and fired 2 rounds into what was left of her head. And then they stuffed her head first into a 55-gallon drum along with some rubber scrap from work so it would get really hot. These 2 men lit her ablaze, stood there, watched the flesh melt off of her feet, and then went out to get some breakfast. When they got back to the house, they dragged the bloody mattress, her clothes, and some more rubber to the burn pile, and then dumped what was left of her flaming body on top and gassed it up. For 3 days, these drugged-out degenerates stood around that fire and watched her burn. When nothing remained but ashes, they dumped those into the Elk River and went on about their lives. When it came to Ronnie Gaines, Denise said that he was at the house playing cards when Pat accused him of stealing his wallet and then immediately grabbed an old wooden rocking chair and beat him over the head with it until there was nothing left of the chair but splinters of wood. They drug his body to the bathtub where they cut him into chunks and spread them around the property. Pete had been overheard saying that you could get away with murder if you spread the body across enough states. Who knows where all that man ended up. Then they took his bones to their parents' house over in West Point and burned them. With that done, they headed back to town where Pete burned Ronnie's house to the ground. Terry Lynn Clark did die from an overdose, but it wasn't an accidental one. The reason she had been found in her boyfriend's twin brother's bed is because it had been Pete that injected the fatal dose of secobarbital into her neck. Investigators immediately obtained search warrants. There wasn't a lot of evidence to be found. A piece of a bone in their parents' backyard and a diaper pin that Gwen kept tied to her shoe. But when they sprayed luminol on the farmhouse walls, y'all, it lit up like lightning bugs on a night sky. That with Denise's testimony, open shut case. Pat was convicted of first-degree murder in the case of Gwen Dugger, and Pete was charged with helping dismember and burn her body. Pat was convicted of second-degree murder in the case of Ronnie Gaines, and Pete was charged with the arson of his home, and even with no proof, he took the charge for the death of Terry Lynn Clark, too. Now, an affidavit was filed in 2005 where Pat claimed that Denise had actually been the one to murder Gwen in a jealous rage and that he'd never told his brother for fear of his reaction. He said that he could no longer live with the betrayal of his brother. And in a separate affidavit, Pat said that he had made some of those confessions during the interrogation while pretending to be his twin brother. Is that the betrayal he was speaking of, or does all this just sound like a man who's desperate to get out of prison? Denise passed away in 2008. Pat remains in a special needs facility in the Northwest Correctional Complex in Mountain City, Tennessee. Pat Bondurant is set for release in January of 2069. He is eligible for parole, but he's already been denied twice, once in 2019 and again in 2022. His next hearing is in December of this year, though it doesn't appear as though he would be much of a threat either way. Pete was granted parole on December 26, 2016, declaring himself a changed man after 25 years behind bars. His parole officer refuses to say where he's living these days, but small towns talk, and I can tell you that this one is a little bit too close for my comfort. He has a Facebook page and claims to be an ordained minister able to officiate weddings and burials. I mean, he has experience, and it's good to see that he has plans for the future, even if they are just a skosh-a-tack concerning. All of this begs the question, how well do you know your neighbors? Have any of y'all heard about this case? I personally know a few people who visited the house in its heyday. How about you? Would you have gone inside the Spawn Ranch of the South? I wouldn't have, but tell me below in the comments what you would have done. Please remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share this around with your friends. If you're enjoying the content that I'm bringing and you want to buy me a coffee so I can keep burning the midnight oil of research, I would sure appreciate it. My Cash App is right there below. Thank y'all for listening, and until next time, y'all be good.